You just said that people are not responsible, that they are losing their land, and that they see that almost an invisible force is taking their lands from them. And at the same time, we know, since the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change fourth progress report, positively that this is man-made. Does that result in anger? Are people angry towards the Western world? And if so, what would they expect from an agreement in Copenhagen?
Copenhagen, first and foremost, is, if you like, a safety valve for immediate burst of energy. And at the front of that is a lot of frustration and anger. Definitely. If you hear all the speeches been done by all small island nations, not only in the Pacific, but also members of the Association of Small Island States, AOSIS, which including Caribbeans and other countries. All of them express anger, raw human anger. That's at one level, and it's understandable. But at the same time, amongst leaders, there is a resolve from within, not to be overcome with anger, but to channel that into a meaningful discourse. And I think, as a Pacific Islander, and firmly believe in terms of what IFC teaches and what it's all about, forgiveness is part and parcel of this discourse, where Pacific Islanders have to find within themselves to forgive the developed countries, the bigger polluters, as a way to broker solutions, not only for themselves, but as part of humanity. And I think while we can, like the IPCC enclave of scientists have said, that we should use Pacific Islands or island states as a benchmark of the urgency of climate change, what is needed. But I think the other side of the question is actually, I think the most vulnerable can also be bridge builders for positive solutions. Because on one hand, to know what is at stake, you have to breathe and feel and know what it's like. And from that despair comes gravitation towards solutions. And I think Pacific Islands can be part of that solutions, regardless of their state of despair.
I would say that a part of what we are missing is a sense of urgency in the developed countries, and maybe Pacific Islands can play exactly this role as messengers, and also relativize some of the statements, such as the 2 degrees pathway, which would mean that some of the islands would just disappear. And it seems cynical as an option to argue for a limit which actually might be safe for developed countries, but is everything but safe for Pacific Islands.
2 degrees basically entails, for, if I'm still surviving in 20 plus years, but basically means, from a Pacific Island point of view, for my 2 daughters in their lifetime, one is in the early teen and one is younger, to witness the lowering of the flags of some of the Pacific Island states at the United Nations. And that's a fact. And it's hard to come to terms with. Basically mean, before the whole world comes to its senses, a lot of Pacific Island countries and communities will disappear. And that's something Pacific Islanders are still coming to terms with it, the sense of loss, what it means. So, yeah, and some are already grieving. In the some of the coastal areas, transmigrations already happen. So it's a massive reality. And in Australia, as a Pacific Islander who lives in Australia, for example, Australia, in terms of per capita emissions of carbon in Australia is, if not the highest, one of the highest, the top 3 in the world. It is painful to hear politicians throw figures around as if it's only statistics and forget the human face of it. I think Pacific Islands, I'm glad that some Australian organizations are sending and sponsoring Pacific Islands to be the human face of Copenhagen. And I think their stories not only to be told, but need to be seen and heard. I think the more of those human stories come across, I think the clearer the message.
And I think it's not only the voice of challenge, but it's also the voice of reason, because it's not that the Pacific Islands are the only places on Earth to suffer, but the first ones, and
Yes.
as you said, might
Yes.
be an indicator, so they can send a
Yes.
strong message to the world.
Yes, and the sad thing is, it's a lot of developed countries and communities for that matter, and we are only human. When it comes to hard decisions, we protect our turf. And whereas what we in the Pacific now have learned in the hard way is that that's the last thing you do. You actually think collective. I don't think of my own house in that physical foundation, but I think of the whole community, because everybody suffers equally. And I think the truth will come out. And in some countries the debate is still ongoing. And the truth about the matter is, although climate change impact may be physically and visibly, tangibly obvious for the Pacific, because here it's a whole small island, low-lying atolls actually disappearing. Facts are now being updated since the last IPCC report come out, where continental communities, in fact, are more vulnerable now than they thought. So I think it's only a matter of time where people transpose Pacific Island experience into their own realities. I'm giving you, for example, in Victoria, this year, for the first time, the leading scientific institution in community, CSIRO, come up with a report that linked drought in Victoria to climate change for the first time. So within a short period of time, the discourse has changed in Victoria. So I think it's a matter of time that those stories will impact other continental local area stories. Yeah.
If, let's say, Copenhagen yields to fantastic results, do you think it's already too late to save the Pacific Islands, or are we at the last moment where we can turn the tide?
For the low-lying coral atoll communities, the general consensus now within Pacific communities have been working on this, the most vulnerable villages and people, is it's too late for them in particular. But for the majority of the Pacific Island, they are positive and optimistic, hence a sense of urgency that they bring to Copenhagen, that maybe we can delay the impact of climate change for the majority of them. The three different categories of communities in the Pacific Island, you've got the low-level atolls, those are very vulnerable, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and certain groups in the Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, for example. And you have the high volcanic race islands like Fiji, PNG, but majority of the population, for example, in Fiji and Samoa, live in the coastal areas, for example. That's why the tsunami was quite devastating. And you have the in-between. All of them are most vulnerable, mainly because they live in the coastal areas. The argument, for example, by some Australian climate adaptation specialists is actually for people to move up. The argument to move up to a high altitude. You know the irony of that? In fact, those are the most vulnerable, because you have soil erosion, steep, high incline. In fact, it's much more devastating. All it takes is a high tide, heavy rainfall, and heavy population of a particular area, then it's become a very high risk, and you have mudslides and all that, another dimension to it, to climate change, which is happening anywhere. So we've got nowhere to run. So hence the sense of urgency to stop and to cut emissions as deep as possible in terms of the short term, from now until year 20, and then the long-term strategy, and how do you facilitate that in terms of funding and all that. So at all those levels, short-term, immediate, deep cuts, as deep as possible, and also long-term strategies. I think those need to be taken all as a one package. Yeah. Climate change is a question of survival. It's a life and death issue for Pacific Islanders.